It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. A coal on every stage.
Please, Herbert, stop singing.
Season's greetings. I'm Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this N-scale coaling stage, where all the coal the bad little boys and girls would have received for Christmas has instead been taken by the railway. The build video is linked in the description. Go check it out. First, I primed the model. For this I used SMS Grey Surfacer. I do quite like the SMS surfaces. They're stinky, but good. As you can probably see, the grey is not a perfectly opaque layer. I suspect this has something to do with the model being made from MDF. It seems to kind of absorb the primer, which is fine. In fact, in this case, the patchy, inconsistent colour helps achieve the effect I want, so I'm not complaining. Time for a base coat. For this, I'm using Vallejo Model Color German Camouflage Medium Brown, which I've applied all over the model, except for the roof, which will be a different colour. I thinned this paint a little bit more than I normally would, so, like the primer, the result does have some inconsistency in the opacity. My thinking was having both coats being kind of patchy would result in a more realistic wooden look, without using wood grain effect paints. I think it's turned out fairly good, but it could still do with a bit more, so I dry brush on some highlights using model color Beige Brown. This is mostly focused on upper edges, like the framing of the shed, walls, stairs, and surfaces that might have a little bit more wear than others. You can see I've added a lot of this colour where, I would imagine, people would be walking about more, scuffing up the wood with their feet. I then base coated the roof with Ammo by MIG rubber and tyres. Obviously a roof is neither rubber nor tyres, but I thought this was an interesting colour to use, so I used it. This is an airbrush paint, so it's thin right out of the bottle, and again, it has that slightly inconsistent patchiness to it. More coats would take care of that, but in this case, it's a desired effect. It's like free weathering. Once that's dried, I apply a wash using Army Painter Strong Tone. This is thinned roughly 1 part Strong Tone to 2 parts distilled water, and I slather it all over the model, though I am being careful to avoid letting too much of it pool up in any one spot, because when it dries, it will create tide marks. If it's not dark enough, simply do another coat when the first is dry. You can see this makes the whole thing a bit darker, which was the idea. It also adds to that inconsistent, sort of dirty look. Not wildly inconsistent, just enough to look worn and used. I then applied another dry brushing of model color Beige Brown to pretty much all the places that were previously dry brushed, though I am doing it a little bit lighter and a little bit less. I make sure it's not covering everything beneath so as to not make the first dry brushing redundant. You may have noticed that I damaged, or rather re-damaged, the hand railing on the stairs while applying that dry brushing. Those stairs were a bit of a pain to build, and I did break them while trying to build them, and it was annoying to fix them then. It seemed like it would be even more annoying to try and repair them now, so I replaced them with this set of 3D printed stairs. These are actually from a model of a coaling stage I downloaded some time ago. They did need to be trimmed down a bit, but they fit pretty well, and I think they look right too. They might have taken a little bit more time to make than fixing the broken hand railing, but it was significantly easier and much less aggravating. Maybe I should have done this from the start. I painted them to match the rest of the model, and now it's time for a bit more dry brushing. This time I'm using model color Cork Brown. This, again, goes on the previously highlighted areas, just a bit lighter and less. The idea is to have multiple shades in the highlight. It makes it look more interesting. I think, so far, it's looking pretty good. It does look quite woody and old, but certainly not disused and falling apart old. While printing the new stairs, I also printed a set of fire buckets. I got this particular file from scenic3d.co.uk. I figured life would be a lot easier if I painted these on the supports, so I primed what I wanted to use in black, then I base coated the buckets on the rack with model color red. This isn't the final colour, it's a bit too dark, but it will help the next red cover better over the black primer. I decided I wanted one of the individual buckets for coal, so I painted that with model color deep green, just a random colour for a random bucket. Back to the rack of buckets, to which I applied Vallejo Model Air Scarlet Red. This is yet another imperfect, not solid coat. If you did want a real solid colour, you would simply do another coat or two, but at least in my eyes, this does look a bit more convincing. It is still a fairly consistent colour, but it does look a bit beat up and used, which is what I want. My goal is to build a model that looks like it's on a working railway and not a toy. These fire buckets do have the word fire on them, which is slightly raised, so you could paint that white. However, I've chosen to have mine solid red, mostly because it would be a difficult fiddly task with little to no reward. Anyway, I figured it was probably about time for some coal. But first, more dry brushing. This time black, to represent staining from coal dust, believe it or not. I'm applying this to all the areas I think would have more than just a little bit of contact with the coal. This goes on before the coal, and the reason is probably obvious. But it's because it's easier to apply this without the coal getting in the way. Time for lamp. This is one of the Woodland Scenics Just Light lights, which you probably saw in the build video, which you definitely watched. I did actually paint the wire for this black, but when I pulled it through the hole, it peeled off, so I'll just cover that up later. Installing the light is easy. I put some super glue at the contact point and gently press it into place. It should stay there. I then carefully and gently bend the mounting arm thing upward so that the lamp isn't pointed directly at the wall. Okay, now it's time to add the coal. I had a couple of choices for this. I have some coal from Nock and something called Simply Coal from Rogue Manufacturing. Both of these look pretty good, though the chunks are very large. For N scale, some of them would be knee-high or even bigger. Not really appropriate for shoveling into a locomotive's firebox. I did try crushing both of them, but neither really yielded satisfying results. The third choice was black aquarium sand, which you can see is very small, so that's what I went with. I started with a layer of Mod Podge matte. I'm sure PVA would work just fine, but I had the Mod Podge right there. I then tipped the coal where I want it. I fiddled around with it a bit, but not too much. I tried to make it look like there's been some shoveling in some areas. Not sure how convincing it is, it probably doesn't really matter. Editing Herbert says, maybe a little shovel would have been a good thing to add here. Maybe that's something for future Herbert to worry about. When the coal was where I wanted it, I spritzed it with isopropyl alcohol and then applied a mix of Mod Podge matte, water, and a bit more alcohol, and gently dripped it over the coal, pretty much like you would do with ballast. Before the glue dries, to represent dust and more fine pieces of coal, I took some black pigment and sprinkled it all over the coal. I'm not being especially careful with it, it's okay if it gets in other places. This would be a pretty dirty structure. And I'm also not really concerned if I use a lot of the pigment. I've had this for years and never use it. You'd probably want to use cheaper pigments if you were doing a larger area though. I let it sit for a moment so the glue has a chance to wet and stick a good amount of the pigment down. Then I blow the remaining loose pigment away. Don't do this at your workbench unless you want black dust on everything. I wasn't totally sure this technique would work, but I was fairly confident. And it's turned out really nice, even better than I'd expected. It looks okay in these clips here, but it looks even better later. Back to the buckets. Here I'm dry brushing a highlight on the green bucket. This is a rough mixture of 1 part deep green and 1 part model colour buff. It's just to add a bit of interest. I then glue the green bucket into place here. It did become dislodged at some point, so it'll be in a different position later on.
Why is there a bucket there, Herbert?
I hear you say. Well, in my imagination, the bucket belongs to the nearby signal box, which almost certainly has a little coal-fired stove for heating, so the signalman brings his little bucket over and helps himself to a cheeky bit of coal. I just thought it might be an interesting little bit of visual storytelling. Anyway, I follow that by gluing the rack of buckets into place here, against the wall. I wasn't totally sure where this should go. I was originally going to place them on the back of the shed, next to the steps, but I figured it would look a bit more interesting here, and they're underneath the light, so maybe that's a good safety feature? I don't know. I don't even know if this kind of structure would have had fire buckets to begin with. You can see the fire buckets have sand in them now. Because I'm so good at video, I forgot to video it, but what I did was put sand-coloured pigment into the bucket, brush it away from areas that I didn't want to be sand-coloured, mist it with isopropyl alcohol, and then add a drop of matte varnish on top. It seems to have worked pretty well. I figured real sand would have been out of scale. Also, I didn't have any real sand. If you look closely, you can see there was a little bit of shrinkage, but they look fine, especially from a distance. On the light fitting, I've applied undiluted army painted dark tone. In retrospect, this might have been a little bit too much. It's ended up really dirty looking, but that is better than it being really clean and toy-like. I also added a bit of water to the dark tone. It was mixed on the brush, so I've got no idea what the ratio is, but I applied this to the buckets in order to dirty those up and blend them in a bit. As one last little touch, I used some Camo Satin black wash around the lower areas of the shed and the coal piles. I didn't really do a good job focusing the camera, you can kinda see what I'm doing. I apply the wash undiluted, then I add water to the brush and use that to spread it around a bit and try to blend it in. This is mostly to make the corners along the wall and down the stairs look like coal dust is collecting there and not being swept away. To finish the model, I applied a coat of matte varnish, which makes the whole model look really good. I'm not quite ready to install it on the layout just yet, but why not test fit? Maybe you can see that I've cut the road bed away a bit so I can get the stage close enough to the track. I think it might need to be raised up maybe a millimeter or two, so I will probably put it on a base, then add some dirt and maybe weeds underneath before gluing it into place. There's a few other things that need to be painted and made ready for this scene, like the water tower and buffer stop, and those are things for future Herbert to worry about. Here's the coaling stage on the Spinny Boy, just for a nice look at it from all angles, I suppose. As I mentioned, there's a build video linked in the description. This kit is from an Australian manufacturer named Trackside Models, and it's an N-scale MDF kit. Clearly I've made a couple of additions and modifications, but nothing too much, and probably over time I'll add more, like a shovel, and maybe some figures. I think this has turned out really good. I'm especially happy with the coal. It turned out so much better than I'd expected. The coal looks like it's in scale, and I guess this is probably what I'll be doing for wagon loads and in loco bunkers in the future. This was a good, enjoyable model to build, and I quite enjoyed painting it too. And I've got to say, I'm pretty excited to see it amongst actual scenery instead of plywood and blue foam. That will take a while, but this has motivated me to continue, so it might be sooner than later that there's something else here too. At least a tiny little bit of a scene. Anyway, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section below. Subscribe here if you want to see more of this kind of thing, share the video with anybody you think might find it helpful, and if you really like what I do, and you want to see videos a bit early, consider supporting on Patreon or Ko-fi, links are in the description. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.